Welcome everybody who's with us. I'm Esther and I'm chairing today's session, and I'd like to introduce Andrew, who's a senior advisor at Pollard Thomas Edwards, a very good architecture firm. And Andrew, you moved there, I think, just directly the year after you, or year before you qualified from Cambridge, and you're part of the DNA of that organisation.
Yes, man and
And
boy. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And you were a director, and now you are a senior advisor, one of two senior advisors. And in particular, you support the Knowledge Hub and the research and development side of the business. And you do a lot of communicating of architectural issues on various design review panels, and altogether a good egg who knows a lot about built environment and architecture, and is going to talk to us today about mansion blocks. So going to talk to us for about half an hour, 20 minutes, half an hour, Andrew. Then we're going to have a bit of a conversation and questions. So please do pop your questions in the chat if you can, if you're listening now. And Andrew, over to you, please.
Thanks very much, Esther. I've just seen a note in the chat about subtitles. I don't know if Rowena can facilitate that. I will talk as clearly and loudly as I can. I've not had a problem in the past, although I do have my voice may start to go if I shout. So apologies to any who are hard of hearing, which I am as well, by the way. Anyway, let's hope it works and that you can hear what I have to say. So as you've gathered, this talk is about mansion flats, but it's one of a series about where Londoners live. And as I mentioned just now, in May, I'm going to be talking about interwar semi-detached houses. And if I'm asked back, I have talks in preparation about the terraced house and the deck access flat. And these are all types that I'm very familiar with from nearly 40 years in housing practice. What I'm interested in is the ordinary places, the most common types of home and neighbourhood which have driven London's historic expansion, not just the architectural award winners, which tend by definition to be exceptional. So I want to explore what makes these ordinary places enduringly popular and what we can learn from them when considering how to revive existing neighbourhoods and how to create new ones today. And I'm speaking as a practicing architect. I'm not an academic historian, although there is some history in this talk. I hope people more expert than me will chip in at the end from the audience. And I'm also speaking as a Londoner, albeit I didn't grow up here, but all my working life has been here. And I'm going to draw on personal memories of the places I've lived in or that I know well for other reasons. So this talk is also in part a sort of memoir. And finally, I want to use this story to show how much London's changed over the past 100 years or so, but also how much has stayed the same. For example, London's long been an international multicultural hub with an obsession for coffee and home deliveries. Our generation didn't invent all that. So Rowena's very kindly offered to do the slides. So Rowena, if we can have the first one, which is just the title slide. So just on this. So my starting point is this, that the mansion block is back in fashion as an inspiration for today's housing. And we hear phrases like modern mansion block and the new London vernacular, which aim to confer a sort of comforting connection with London's domestic heritage, even when the proposals are bafflingly remote from the Victorian and Edwardian originals. For example, I recently saw a 12-story corridor access slab block described by its architect, proud architect, as a contemporary mansion block. Next slide, please, Rowena. And I think the precedent is better understood by government than architects sometimes. The Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, which is now morphed into the Office for Place, for example. Many of you will be familiar with Living with Beauty, which was published early last year. And it promotes the mansion block as part of the way to deliver what they call gentle density and roll back the tide of high rise. Now, with colleagues, I've previously calculated that the original inner London mansion blocks often achieved around 200 homes per hectare. And that qualifies, in my definition, as super density. And it's in the upper range of the GLA's recently retired and much mourned density matrix. And they illustrate their report, Living with Beauty, that is, with one of my favorite examples, and it's this one, the Priors on Hampstead Heath, which I walk past most weekends. I think the fact that we can use the word mansion today without blushing is perhaps evidence of the popularity and durability of the originals, which were generally aimed at the more prosperous end of society, and in contrast to charitable dwellings for the poor, which adopted a distinctive architectural form and language, including deck access tenements. Next, please, Rowena. There's no commonly agreed technical definition of mansion block or mansion flat. Estate agents like the status conferred by mansion, and Wikipedia follows suit with, quote, apartments designed for the appearance of grandeur. One of the earliest examples, actually not the very earliest, although many people think it is of course Richard Norman Shaw's Albert Hall mansions of 1879. Now, purpose-built flats for the wealthier classes were such a rarity in London that the architect travelled to Paris for inspiration. And I'm indebted to Andrew Saint's great biography of Richard Norman Shaw for that anecdote. So these had elaborately articulated and decorated street frontages with grand entrances, which helped to distinguish the new typology from model dwellings for the working classes, which charities such as Peabody started delivering in the 1860s. Next, please. Herman Mutasius was a German envoy sent to study English domestic architecture, and his monumental work, The English House, I won't attempt the German, published in 1904, devoted just 3 rather skeptical pages to flats, with Albert Hall mansions as his main example. These are the plans. He wrote, quote, opinion is deeply divided as to whether there is a future for flat dwelling in England. And he also had prescient views about overdevelopment, which we might do well to heed today. Quote, the sin of building to too high a density has frequently been committed. Flats built to too high a density are a poor investment. In The Age of Innocence, published in 1920, the American novelist Edith Wharton satirizes social attitudes to what was sometimes called French flats. Quote, that was how women with lovers lived in wicked old societies, in apartments with all the rooms on one floor and all the indecent propinquities. Next, please. So my definition of a mansion block might run something like this. Mid-rise apartment block, typically 4 to 8 stories, with 2 to 8 flats per level, usually arranged around a compact stair core, and adjoining blocks are often grouped to create a continuous street frontage, each having a prominent front door. Bit of a mouthful, I'm afraid, but it's complex definition. And that distances mansion blocks from other common contemporary typologies, such as corridor access, deck or gallery access, and point block. What you're looking at here is a project that we did at one of our own property developments, actually, on City Road Basin, which was indeed a series of modern mansion blocks. The 4 separate adjoining blocks. And one of the things about this is that it's multi-tenure. So it contains everything from very swanky penthouses for wealthy people to affordable social housing, and you can't tell the difference from the outside. So next, please, Esther. My enthusiasm for the mansion block began in childhood. You're going to hear about that in a minute, I'm afraid. And it was reignited by recent walks in lockdown London. And my work and that of colleagues at Pollard Thomas Edwards has long been influenced by this typology. We've built many variations over the past 40 years, and I admit we often use the phrase modern mansion block. And these projects have provided homes for all sorts of people, from wealthy penthouse power couples to disadvantaged families. In the late 90s, we did a row of mansion blocks overlooking Victoria Park and the canal, which you can see here. I know stylistically they might look a bit dated today. And I remember that one local family occupied 3 separate flats. The parents were social renters, one adult daughter bought under a shared ownership scheme, and one was able to buy outright. So these were truly mansions for the many. And now I'm going to talk about some mansion block milestones on my personal journey, which also chart the changing character of London and show how the typology has evolved from exclusive to inclusive. Next, please. So as a child, I'd be taken by train up to London to visit my grandmother at Sloane Gate Mansions in Doyley Street, round the corner from the Cadogan Hall. My grandmother Victoria lived with her sister Rita on the first floor. The bay-windowed sitting room and their 2 bedrooms overlooked the street, and the bedrooms were wedge-shaped to turn the corner. The hall was big enough to contain a mahogany dining table, and lunch was wheeled here on a small trolley from the servants' wing at the back. There were no servants and not much money. And I was already fascinated by people's homes and intrigued by the complexity of my grandmother's flat with its original scullery, kitchen, and sewing room. She was born in 1898 in South Africa and sent to London on the White Star Line in 1920 to find a suitable husband. She married a former cavalry officer who founded the Nairobi Coffee Company. And my grandfather was apparently a great salesman and a pioneer of today's ubiquitous coffee culture, obtaining wholesale orders from the West End hotels. He died in 1957, and my grandmother lived as a widow for 33 years. She loved London, and she seldom ventured far from Sloane Gate Mansions. The world came to her with a constant stream of visitors from faraway places. Peter Jones supplied all of life's necessities, and Harrods Food Hall the occasional treat, and both were, of course, delivered to the door, just as we expect today. Downstairs in the flat below, briefly lived Mitch Mitchell, drummer to the Jimi Hendrix Experience, which my great aunt described as a very polite young man. My grandparents never owned property. It was more normal to rent in those days. And from overheard conversations among the grown-ups, I gathered that my grandmother's rent was controlled and modest, and that she ignored all inducements from her landlord to vacate. She lived in a time capsule. The furniture and decoration were mostly from the 1920s, with some earlier antiques. And as they got older, the money became tighter. The better pieces gradually thinned out. There was a sort of shrine with military portraits of my grandfather and his brother, who had died on the Somme, with their medals displayed in a glass cabinet. Rita had designed lampshades and curtains for Fortnum and Mason in the 20s. There were lots of tassels. And I was aware of the contrast between the front rooms and the back rooms, which featured linoleum and utility furniture, which was mass-produced in plywood after World War II, and I've still got several pieces. Next, please. After my grandmother died, the few remaining antiques crossed London from Sloane Gate Mansions to Gardner Mansions on Church Row in Hampstead, joining the treasures which my uncle and aunt had assembled in a lifetime working in the Near East. They're still there in their 90s. It's a typical mansion block plan with a formal front room flooded with light from its south-facing bay window, and then a long tail of back rooms dimly lit from a small internal light well. A long corridor is lined with bookshelves and pictures. We tend to regard circulation today as a waste of space, but mansion flats demonstrate that it can make a positive contribution to domestic character and utility. My uncle's flat, like my grandmother's, was built with a miniature service wing at the back, and this has converted seamlessly into a self-contained micro flat for a lodger. Gardner Mansions consists of 20 flats in 2 adjoining blocks built in 1898 and slotted into one of Hampstead's oldest streets. There are no lifts to serve the 5 stories plus semi-basement, which even today would be costly for such small blocks. But this enables just 2 flats per landing, with every flat enjoying the full depth of the building. The small size of the blocks, the generous design of the stair and the landings makes Gardner Mansions a very neighbourly place. Everyone seems to know everyone else, despite nearly every household being from a different country of origin. Or perhaps the global mix actually promotes interest in and courtesy towards neighbours. During the pandemic, several people in the block are looking out for my elderly relatives and providing practical help with shopping. The lobby name boards, which you can see here, identifying each resident and whether they are in or out, are a symbol of trust and openness. And I do wonder if we should reintroduce them to modern apartment blocks, but I know very well what the crime prevention officer would have to say. Next, please. My first major job as a newly qualified project architect in 1985 was the remodelling of a pair of mansion blocks in Candover Street and Riding House Street on the Howard de Walden estate. Actually, so I think it's a great Portland estate. Towering York houses were designed by Herbert Fuller Clark in 1903 to house respectable clerks of modest means. There's a great article about them by Robert Thorne in the Architect's Journal from 1988, volume 189, if you're interested. The flats were self-contained but tiny, with a sitting room at the front, a bedroom and a small kitchen pantry at the back. Overall size was 38 square meters, which makes them pretty much the same as today's London plan studio flat. These were the micro flats of their day, a century before pocket living. They had a loo, but no bathroom. Baths were taken in a tub in the kitchen. All the original ogival mouldings, doors and built-in cupboards survived. And again, there was no lift to serve the 2 flats per floor over 5 stories. No expense was spared on the exterior, which features bay windows and stair towers with fine Queen Anne Revival proportions and red brickwork decorated with white rendered banding. The most striking feature, which you can see on the left here, is the green and gold mosaic advertisement for T.J. Bolting and Sons, sanitary and hot water engineers, which was also the developer. It's hard to imagine today a business having the sense of permanence to enshrine its marketing in mosaic, or a planning authority agreeing to make an advertising hoarding the main feature of an apartment block. Our task was to retain all the key features of these grade 2 listed buildings, or to replace them with replicas where deterioration or fire regulation is required, whilst updating them for modern lifestyles. So we took down the rear extensions, which backed into a deep light well, and we replaced them with new bathrooms and kitchens. We also extended the stairs up to access new shared roof gardens. You can see the plans, the before plan at the top and the after plan at the bottom there. So these blocks were owned by Community Housing Association, CHA, which was later absorbed into the giant One Housing. This was my first experience of resident engagement, and I was rather surprised that the tenants were not the downtrodden poor, but middle-class professionals. I remember doing bespoke interior designs for a journalist. As well as serving disadvantaged people, housing associations at that time provided rented homes for those on moderate incomes who couldn't afford to buy in London, certainly not in Westminster, what I suppose later became known as the missing middle. The procurement and contract administration were also rather different from today. The contractor was a family firm with directly employed craftspeople who knew how to build without being closely instructed. and they tolerated being supervised by an inexperienced young architect, and they helpfully corrected my more foolish instructions. The final account was agreed over a pub lunch, and the Housing Corporation accepted overspend up to 15% of their already generous 100% grant funding. Next, please. When I first moved to London as a newly graduated architect, I lodged with a childhood friend. Our mothers had met in the wartime Navy, and his had later lived in Martian Street, in what was then a service department, with meals, laundry, and cleaning services available on site, rather like today's top-end build-to-rent developments with their lavish facilities and service charges to match. Martian Court was designed by T.P. Bennett and Son in 1937, with crystal windows and curved balconies in a restrained modern style. Its 10 stories, matching its opposite neighbour, left the narrow street and many of the flats in permanent shadow, but it gave me the exciting illusion of living in New York rather than London. From the 4th floor, we could see the sky only by leaning out. Martian Court and its many siblings in 1930s London still just about meet my criteria for a mansion block, although the height stretches my definition of mid-rise. There are 6 flats around each landing, rather than the conventional pairing that I've been talking about, but mercifully there are lifts. Another key innovation is the uniting of 2 cores at ground level into one entrance foyer, which was presided over by a terrifying porter, rumoured to have spent time in the military prison at Colchester. Excuse me. He disapproved strongly of my bicycle, which lowered the tone when I wheeled it through the foyer into the rear service yard. Unlike today's London plan requirements for lavish cycle stores in every apartment block, Martian Court had no facilities, and I parked out by the bins. There was an upside to this. The service yard was shared with an upmarket restaurant favoured by the political establishment, and in the summer months, I'd arrive home to observe the manager, Germano, dining early by the bins. His table was laid with linen, crystal, and silverware, and the sommelier and waiting staff practiced their trade under his critical eye. At around 61 square metres, the flats were compact and closely prefigured today's national space standards. And today's London plan requires every flat to have a decent balcony, big enough for outdoor meals and lockdown cocktails. It wasn't always so. Martian Court and the Edwardian flats in this story had decorative balconies, which weren't much used for anything except a few unhappy pot plants. However, we did have London wildlife. Our caged budgerigars were assaulted one afternoon by, I think, a buzzard, and I was alerted by a piercing screech as the budgies counter-attacked their assailant, whose talons were caught in the cage. Next, please. Given my early indoctrination to the joys of mansion flats, it's not surprising that the first home I bought in 1987 was in Albany Mansions on Albert Bridge Road, which, along with Prince of Wales Drive, overlooks and encloses Battersea Park. Prince of Wales Drive provides a spectacular cliff face of late Victorian architecture. The individual mansions, I'm going to name them, Connaught, Norfolk, Cyril, Overstrand, Carlton, and Primrose, form a continuous 5-storey frontage over 1 kilometre long, broken only by 6 narrow cross streets. And I often quote this to planning officers who want to drive big gaps through everything to make it, in the jargon, more permeable. Albany Mansions is the same height, but with less assertive architecture. There are 8 adjoining blocks, each with its stair and front door, and like Gardner Mansions, the flats are paired around the staircase, each having one good room on the park and a long tail of secondary rooms around a light well. And from our bay window, which you can see on the left, we observe the Friday night cruise past of classic cars, the year-round Christmas lights of Albert Bridge, and the devastated park trees after the Great Storm of 1987. The same plan generates 1, 2 and 3 bedroom flats. You can see this in the diagram at the bottom right. The larger flats steal, as it were, rooms from the back of the smaller ones. In modern apartment blocks, values increase with height, but with no lift. The first floor was the most expensive and the top floor much cheaper. We could choose between a 1 bedroom lower down or 2 on top, and we opted for accessibility over space and light. Next, please. Around this time, the original 99-year leases were renewed on the great mansion blocks near Westminster Cathedral in Victoria. At around £98,000 for a 2-bedroom flat, they were way beyond our budget, but we went to view some out of curiosity. At 6 and 7 stories above a half basement, Morpeth and Carlisle mansions are even grander than Prince of Wales Drive. They run parallel to one another, and they're separated by a 3-metre wide canyon clad in white glazed bricks to lighten the gloom in the back rooms. This arrangement is absolutely unthinkable under today's regulations, but it seemed to me an entirely satisfactory trade-off for the glorious street-facing rooms. Next, please. So we defected from South London and Albany mansions to raise a family in Barnet, and later to occupy a PTE townhouse development in Muswell Hill, which is where I'm speaking from today. But the pull of the mansion block has remained strong, and our neighbourhood contains some fine examples. And these inspired the practices designed for a recent local development for active older people. This is Woodside Square. Older people who want to live in tranquil surroundings, but close to a town centre and with easy access to the rest of London. Perhaps I will end my days here. Every flat has views in 2 or 3 directions and a big balcony onto a garden square. What's really unusual is that affordable homes for rent or shared ownership are completely integrated with homes bought by wealthy downsizers. Pepper potting of different tenures is usually resisted by developers and social landlords alike, partly for practical reasons of management and service charges, but also out of a sort of atavistic fear of conflict between the classes. But here, social inclusivity seems to work fine. Maybe older people are more inclined to love their neighbours, but I doubt it. I think it comes down to the intimacy of the mansion block, where everyone can know their neighbours and take ownership of the shared spaces. Next, please. If Woodside Square is a model for older people living in London suburbs, New Garden Quarter next to Stratford and the former Olympic Village is all about bringing families back to the city. 45% of the 470 apartments are family flats with 3 bedrooms or more, and 35% of all the homes are affordable. They're arranged in 7-story mansion blocks around a big new London square. And from their private balcony, parents can watch their children playing in the square below. We filmed interviews with residents during lockdown, where the square was intensively used for socially distanced recreation by adults and children. The planning requirement to include larger homes, even in high-density apartment developments, is controversial. There's significantly more profit in 1 and 2 bedroom flats, which have been the preferred product of London's developers for 20 years and more. Now, this isn't just about greed. More profit means more affordable housing and higher contributions to infrastructure and other local benefits. Some also argue that London's suburbs already have a big stock of family houses, and the time-honoured pattern is for people to move outwards for more space. Although nowadays, the search for affordability is pushing young families beyond Ruislip to create Generation Reading. And still others claim, in a throwback to the Victorians' tardiness to embrace apartment living, that British families simply have no desire to live in flats, unlike their less fortunate continental cousins, and that when they're built grudgingly to satisfy planning requirements, so-called family flats are actually occupied by sharers and students. Whatever the true status of supply and demand, the family apartments here at New Garden Quarter sold well, and they sold to families. And PTE developed a set of new apartment and duplex typologies specifically designed to appeal to buyers and renters with young children. Many have open plan, kitchen, living, dining rooms running the full depth of the block with outlook and balconies on both sides to capture sun throughout the day. Next, please, Rowena. And my last example, this is Lissenden Gardens. And although I've lived in North London for over 30 years, it took a global pandemic and the restrictions of lockdown to get me exploring hitherto undiscovered local places. I'm sure it's the same for many of us. One revelation for me has been Lissenden Gardens between Gospel Oak and Hampstead Heath, 2 streets and a small square lined with dark red brick mansion blocks. They're quite austere and they carry the patina of age. It's like stepping into the 1950s, an effect which is reinforced by a blue plaque to R.H. Tawney, economic historian, Christian socialist, and founding father of the welfare state. The place appears, in the best sense, to be completely unmodernized. The equivalent blocks in nearby Hampstead and Highgate have been primped and polished to shine in the windows of 100 estate agents. Developed in 1898 by Alfred Armstrong, an enterprising engineer who brought electricity to swathes of Hampstead, and owned by his descendants until 1972, the entire estate of 250 flats was sold to Frank Dobson's Camden Council, following a campaign by its tenants, who then resisted comprehensive modernisation and remained guardians of its special genius loci. And I owe this to a wonderful book of local history, which I commend to you, called To Paradise by Way of Gospel Oak, a mansion flat estate and the forces that shaped it, written by a resident of Lissenden Gardens called Rosalind Bailey. And she reproduces these plans of Lissenden and an earlier development by the same architects, Burmer and Gibbs. And I just want to point out a fascinating thing here, which is the left-hand plan, which is the earlier one. You can see a complete separation between the drawing room, dining room, the day rooms where you might have guests at the front of the building, and the bedrooms and bathrooms at the back, to which you would never invite guests, unless you're French, of course. And then on the right, we've got Lissenden, which breaks with that convention, very daring. And you can see that the living room, the day spaces and the bedrooms are all intermixed. And what that gives you is a drawing room onto the street, and then a dining room with a proper balcony this time onto the back, which has the view over Hampstead Heath. So you get the best of everything. But you do risk those propinquities which we heard about earlier on. And she's also found some lovely quotes. And here's just one of them. This is from 1907, an observation. Quote, members of the middle class are called upon to keep up a position more or less beyond their means. This fact no architect should forget when designing a block of flats. His building should have style. None who looks from the outside should be able to guess that the rents are low. Lissenden Gardens exemplifies the durability, the inclusiveness, and the quiet dignity of London's mansion blocks. And it reinforces my conviction that this typology should play a continuing role in providing great new homes and neighbourhoods for Londoners across the spectrum of income, age, tenure, and household size. I just want to end by summing up some of the merits of mansion blocks. Thanks, Rowena. So modern mansion blocks, interpretations designed today, they can do all these things. Next, please. Achieve remarkably high densities without resort to tall buildings. Next. Provide sociable clusters of homes, encouraging neighbourliness. Next. Animate streets with continuous frontage and plenty of front doors. Accommodate all sorts of different households and homes behind a unified facade, and seamlessly integrate different tenures within one block or one street frontage. And use space efficiently with compact common parts. And they show how joyful detailing of entrances, bay windows, and balconies can enrich our lives. And in conclusion, mansion blocks also challenge some of the orthodoxies of London's planning standards, which, for all their merit, and they have been very successful, I think, in fending off mediocrity and achieving a good level of quality, but they also tend to impose a certain sameness across the capital. You may have noticed this in modern housing. So they may require trade-offs, mansion blocks that is, in daylight and sunlight to some rooms. They may not achieve dual aspect for every home. They may have reduced privacy distances at the rear. And yet, like London's terraced housing stock, they're enduringly popular and in demand, and we should learn from that. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, very much indeed. That was absolutely fascinating. Your grandparents look like real characters, and it's lovely to hear your personal story of your knowledge of the different mansion block homes, talking from experience, that's for sure. I did put in the chat asking the delegates here, the people listening, the audience, what they think the definition of a mansion block might be. No one's actually put any replies to that in, but I do wonder if it matters actually. And I was very taken by what you're saying about changing people's attitudes to a new way of living, of the French way of living, really. And I wonder if there's any lessons for today in terms of the way that we are describing and marketing homes that we're building, which is trying to introduce different ways of living, and whether that's one of the lessons that we're taking forward from the mansion blocks, as well as the physicality of their designs and what they're providing. Have you got any thoughts on that and sort of the more marketing side of the whole, let's make it look grand on the outside? Is that what we're trying to do with beauty and offers a place, etc.?
Well, firstly, I think the kind of marketing conventions are very well established, and they all look the same, don't they? They emphasize shininess, and they almost always seem to want to appeal to young couples, unless they're specifically designed for older people, in which case they are shown appealing to older people who look like they're behaving like young couples. So it's quite limited, and I may, perhaps the audience can correct me, but you don't often see advertisements for or marketing material for apartments which are all about families. So clearly, one of the points I've been trying to make is that mansion blocks do provide a precedent for larger flats which are suitable for families, although I admit I did not grow up in one, provided, of course, that they are part of a neighbourhood which provides every gradation of outdoor space, private, shared and public open space, and enough of it and the right sort. So, and the scheme I showed towards the end, New Garden Quarter, which indeed had all the usual glamorous advertising, shows that, and I think it's proven that, apartment living for families can be terrific and very popular. I suppose the second message I've been making is about density and height, and also maybe something about architectural language. And you'll have noticed that there's a few tall buildings going up in London, 540 something the last count, and that debate is for another day. We'll have that one another time. But my point is that there is an alternative in the terms of, by way of mid-rise. It can achieve some quite surprisingly high densities, so very efficient land use, and maybe it lends itself also to a rather different aesthetic, which can be modern, which New Garden Quarter definitely is, but also maybe is a bit more referential of its Victorian Edwardian inspiration. Sorry, I'm not sure if I answered your question.
No, I think it does, and I think what you're saying about attracting families to flatted life, as it were, is really interesting, and trying to break the stereotype that flats are only for young people or old people, as it were, that they can be for your whole life. And I'm just wondering what there is that about a modern mansion block which can do that. And you did mention with one of your examples how everybody knew each other and there was real neighborliness and everyone's using the same very grand and attractive entrance area. And I wonder if there's anything about the way this type of density of block of flats works with a number of entrances, a number of units off cores, which can support neighborliness and neighbors coming together and sharing certain spaces, which maybe is good particularly for families. Is there anything about that that you'd like
Well,
to
I think
say?
it's good for everyone, and I do think that there is something special about that, and that's partly why I think the mansion block is a distinctive typology, and therefore it having some kind of definition is worthwhile and important. And aspects of that definition include having a front door on the street which serves a limited number of homes, and then rather than just making the block bigger and bigger and bigger off that one front door, you have another one next to it, like a terrace of flats, and they're designed to join together, like a terrace or a train, if you like, coupled together. And that is different from the trend towards serving as many flats as possible off one entrance. That trend is partly driven by the whole concierge thing, and partly by the perceived desire of purchasers. This may be partly influenced by international norms to have one secure entrance with a person sitting there overlooking it. But it's not the only way, and actually historically it's not the London way. And it's perfectly possible, and we've done it many times, to have a row of buildings with separate entrances, concierge in one place, and then with today's modern CCTV and communication, all the rest of it, they can easily look out for a row of entrances like that. So one entrance and then a limited number of people off each landing, which of course is a London plan
Absolutely.
rule, but one that's very often flouted.
So they are, yeah, more personal, more ability to actually personalize your own home, to say, that's where I live, that one there, that window. It's because on some sort of much higher density developments, it's very hard to explain where your home is, or to even understand where your home is sometimes when you're outside. But partly the need, the type of lifestyles that people may be looking for, want to be promoted, sustainability reasons nowadays, is more about living local and a mix of use. And there is a point in the chat about having mixed use within a mansion block, not something that was seen in the original ones, I guess. Is there anything you'd like to say about that?
Yeah, I think it is unusual in the originals. I can't remember. I'd love to know if any listeners do know of Victorian or Edwardian mansion blocks that incorporated other uses. Interestingly, of course, charitable dwellings for the poor quite often did so, with club rooms and classrooms and in places for self-improvement. In the 1930s, you get the serviced block, and so Martian Court, which I described, absolutely had this restaurant embedded in it, and the residents had a discount there and dining rights. And I could tell you funny stories about that, but there isn't time for that yet tonight. And indeed, our other kind of, some of the contemporary examples I showed, Woodside Square has what we call a co-house. So the ground floor of one of the blocks has a terrific meeting room where people have parties, or they have yoga classes, or all the rest of it. There's also a guest room, a sort of swanky suite that you can rent for your overnight guests. It's got all that. And New Garden Quarter has also got a nursery and gym and all the things that you kind of expect from a large modern apartment development.
Yeah, so they can be flexible. And there's another question in the chat about how people found living in mansion blocks during COVID lockdowns. And there's also questions or observations about the fact that they had a lot of walls, the original mansion blocks, and also there was good sound insulation. Whereas you were also explaining how the servants section, where the kitchen is, was sort of at the back and darker, which is not necessarily how we would want to live today, where the kitchen is actually the heart of the home. That's fine if you go out and buy all your food outside and restaurants and takeaways, and maybe some
Yeah.
people do that. But how well can the mansion block actually adapt to changing living patterns and changing circumstances? Can they be adapted? Can they be retrofitted? Can they? Do you know how people found living in mansion blocks? You yourself, but others
During the
lockdown?
pandemic.
Yeah,
Well, I don't now live in a mansion block, but I mentioned my aunt and uncle who do. That was Gardner Mansions, and I talked about the sociability of that and
modern
the
mansion block you live in now.
yeah the way in which neighbours has helped out. I'm not saying that's unique to mansion blocks, but it worked really well there. Your question about adaptability, I suppose there's two aspects to that. One is how you use rooms, and the other is about upgrading for energy standards, for example, more technical aspect. On the first thing, so I mean, mansion blocks, I mean, they're load-bearing masonry, so knocking walls down is something you should do with great care. They also have big chimney breasts, which you also should not be lightly mucking about with. But that's not to say you can't change the function of rooms. And yes, if you're a keen cook and you like spending time in the kitchen, you probably want to bring that forward into one of the better lit street-facing rooms. And I guess there is an inadequacy in terms of working from home, if you want to, because the bedrooms are typically not very well lit. So you do that in your wonderful front room again. But yes, you can change the functions around, and we did that in our Albany Mansions flat. And I think the thing about the big ones with the service zones offer all kinds of interesting opportunities, because you can, to some degree, isolate those as a micro flat, which you might rent out, or you might have a carer if you're an old person, or a, dare I say, a nanny if anyone can afford those today. But it's not easy to make them completely independent with their own entrance, unless you're going to put in an extra kind of stair at the back and really muck about. On the technical point, I mean, the first point is I'd argue that these buildings have lasted incredibly well, and they've got no sign of going away. 120 years and counting. So in terms of embodied carbon, they're doing a great job. In terms of operational carbon and heating costs, not so great. I mean, they've got robust, thick brick walls with plaster, which are better than people think, actually. They perform better than their reputation. Windows tend to be drafty. We're not about to slap insulated render cladding on them, I hope. And many of them are in conservation areas on the listed buildings anyway, so you can't do that. You can insulate on the inside, but to do that properly, you need to either remove or replicate the moldings, and you'll lose a little bit of space. Probably the best investment is and it's expensive, is to upgrade the windows. And if you get really good double glazed draft-proof replicas, that would make a big difference to the energy performance. But good ones that look the same, they're expensive.
Not UPVC. There's a question in the chat about the tension between the leaseholders and the freeholders in terms of upgrading and retrofitting. Have you had any experience of that, of how that sort of thing can work, how to diffuse the tensions?
I've not had personal experience of that.
That's okay. It's the same with any kind of leasehold.
I think Lissenden Mansions could be a really interesting case in point. And I'd have to go back to that excellent book that I recommended, but I think there were issues there around, because flats were sold off in, I think, the brief interlude before Camden Council took control. So I think that historically there have been tensions there,
or
and
maybe
some listeners
some of the
may have
people
experience.
listening want to
Yeah.
put some answers to that, because there's quite a few really interesting comments in the chat about people who know different mansion blocks or have questions about specific ones. So please do, sort of, if you know how tensions have been dealt with or what's happened to some of the older blocks, pop them in. I'm sure everyone will be interested to see. But that issue about retrofitting and flexibility and adaptability, maybe it's better. The mansion blocks, new and old, are better suited to adapting than the tower blocks that we've been building, which seem to have zero adaptability as far as I can see. But maybe
That's
I'm
for another day, I think. Yes.
Can I take you
True.
back to the questions about how mansion blocks fit into neighbourhoods and fit into the city? And obviously we've got some in some parts of, they're, although they are all over London, they are concentrated in certain areas where there tends to be very good public transport and connectivity, and really good town centres and high streets, or areas where there is that offer to live outside your home as well as inside your home. How do you see them transferring to other areas where there isn't so much mixed use or isn't so much connectivity?
Yeah.
And where also maybe sites are small. So there's one thing when you've got big sites and you can put big buildings on, but infill sites, do you feel that they are more appropriate in certain types of place than others?
No, I think the mid-rise mansion block, given that London is densifying everywhere, whether you like it or not, and whether you agree with the degree of densification and the tower block, which I think is, again, for another talk, don't get me going, the mid-rise mansion block has a part to play in achieving what
Even on small sites and infill sites.
yeah, because you can do one. But I think your question is also very interesting, because it reminds us that a lot of the originals, they completely fill their sites. So of ones I've shown tonight, Sloane Mansions, Gardner Mansions, Prince of Wales Drive, the Great Victoria mansion blocks around the cathedral, they fill their sites. There's very little open space, and what there is these canyon-like service yards. That's utilitarian space, not amenity space. So they depend on having, as you've mentioned, ready access to Battersea Park and St James's Park and or the Bloomsbury Squares or whatever. But that's a model that we are translating into contemporary designs, and you've seen two of those tonight at Woodside Square and New Garden Quarter, where the new buildings are designed in because these are large developments. They're designed with a whole new public realm to support them, and you've got outdoor space outside your shared front door, as well, of course, as having a proper London plan compliant big balcony, which the originals, as I mentioned, tended not to have. But so that model, oh, by the way, what I didn't say about New Garden Quarter, I showed you the big public square, which is open to everybody. It's used by people from all around, not just people who live there, but there are also smaller courtyards, which are exclusive to the residents, and they have under fives play space. They're very sheltered, very secure. So they've got the whole gradation of private, shared, and public.
Thank you for that. So there was a question about do they help with densifying the suburbs? I think you just said yes, they can do. But new mansion blocks are having not only to provide outdoor amenity space, shared and private, which is great, but also cycle storage and potentially in some areas some car parking as well, which obviously the originals didn't use any of that. Is this causing a tension with the typology?
Right. So car parking first. Again, it's a huge subject.
Mhm.
Fortunately, we haven't got too long to launch into, but
You've got 3 more minutes.
yeah. So, I mean, firstly, I'd say I'm confident we're going to see a reduction in car ownership. I mean, it's already happened in central inner London, happened dramatically over the last 25 years. It will come to the suburbs, but I fully appreciate it. There are more difficult challenges there. In the meantime, so in central inner London, we're generally not providing parking at all, and planning doesn't allow us to, except maybe some disabled parking. Stratford, it does have some, New Garden Quarter, and it is in concealed podia, undercrofts. You can't see them from the outside because the flats screen them off, but they are at ground level as well, they're not basement. Woodside Square, which is a very wealthy area, has a full underground car park, I have to admit. But we've done others that have no parking or have a modest amount of surface parking in landscape courts. Bicycles, you heard about Martian Court. There's no provision for bicycles in most of these blocks. You can retrofit into those gloomy service yards to some extent. At least the flats are big, usually. I mentioned the big entrance halls. Isn't that great? We don't design proper entrance halls in flats these days. Mansion blocks have their proper rooms that you enter into. So if you want to take your bicycle upstairs, and I appreciate sometimes that does mean carrying it upstairs, so that's not easy. At least you've got room to store it in your flat. But no, they don't. Some of these blocks don't really have they're not able to offer secure street level.
And when you have to, in new blocks, when you're taking the typology forward and you do have to provide a lot of internal cycling, does that cause a problem with the design?
Well, it's like the parking. I mean, I mean, the GLA and I am a cyclist, and I love cycling, but I'm very pro cycling, but I'm not a fanatic. And the GLA and the local planning authorities, boy, are they into cycling. So we have to provide enormous numbers of secure cycle storage. And for those who don't know, we're also told exactly what kind of racks we're allowed to have and how much space there is between them. So modern developments contain huge areas of very, very expensive to build cycle storage. And I do sometimes wonder if this is the best way. I mean, personally, I'd rather, because blocks all have lifts now, and increasingly we're putting goods lifts in as well. So I'd rather, and most people, if they've got a valuable bike, they take it up to their flat. So let's make the flats bigger so that we can store our precious bikes in there, as well as having bicycle stores for those who prefer to use them. And I'm not forgetting these wonderful cargo bikes, which I see. I mean, that's a terrific. These electric cargo bikes with 2 children on board and or doing deliveries is a great way of easing London's
adapting the typology. So we are just coming to the end, but there's one last question about street votes, where people will be asked to decide in their street, do you want to replace your semi-detaches, which you're talking about next talk, with blocks of flats or mansion blocks. And it just, that brings to mind everything which came out yesterday with the levelling up white paper, and street votes will be part of, I'm guessing, the next stage of planning reforms. Is there any last points that you'd like to make in terms of the role of mansion blocks and mid-density development within the bottom-up community-led approach to planning that we can read into the white paper and the government's announcements, if we are positive enough to do so, a positive attitude to them?
I'm not going to, I think I won't talk about street votes in any detail because it's a complex subject. That's for another day. But I suppose the general point is that it's always been a good idea to ask people what they want. And we've been doing that for 40 years, and we're not alone. Lots of practices have, despite the perceived arrogance of architects go and do their own thing. So we do ask people what they want, but that's not just about asking, it's also about explaining and inspiring and showing people what they can have. There is this assumption, quite widespread, that English people live in houses. And it's not the same in Scotland, by the way. But we've always found that when you explain to people the options that are available to them and some of the benefits of flat living, that when they give them the choice, they might opt for that for all kinds of reasons. And actually, interestingly, quite a range of people at different stages of their lives. So yes, I do think there's some kind of connection between this typology, which we know to be popular because people who have choice have opted to rent and buy mansion flats and to stay in them and to build their lives with them. So I think they do have a place in a series of typologies that can help less disadvantaged areas to level up.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. It's been an absolutely fascinating talk, which people are putting in the chat. Thank you, everyone. And there's loads of questions and comments. I couldn't go through all of them that are there. I don't know if you want to hang about and type anything, if you've got a few minutes, Andrew, to some of the specific.
Just really grateful. I see there are 38. I haven't read them yet. 38 things. I hope they're not too rude, but I'm certainly going to read them all. Yeah, and thank you very much.
And there's questions about being able to get the photos and the names of the places and etc. So thank you very much indeed. It's been a really interesting evening. I've learned a lot. I'm sure other people have as well. Thought-provoking. And thank you everybody who's stayed with us, and have a good evening.
Thanks very much.